Sarah Whitmore watched the last wagon disappear into the howling blizzard. Her husband's promise to return for her and the twins was already being swallowed by the merciless Wyoming wind. The 24-year-old widow clutched her two sleeping infants closer as the brutal November storm intensified. She understood the truth with devastating clarity. The settler train wasn't coming back for a woman with two babies who would slow them down. Left alone at what remained of their burned cabin, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a mother's fierce determination, Sarah faced an impossible choice: surrender to the coming freeze, or find a way to keep her children alive when death seemed the only certainty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind shrieked across the open plains, carrying snow that cut like broken glass against Sarah's face. The twins, baby Jonathan and Mary, pressed against her chest beneath her wool coat, their small bodies radiating a warmth that felt like the last ember in an endless night. The cabin behind her was nothing but charred ruins, destroyed when the Sioux war party had swept through 2 days ago. Her husband, Robert, hadn't even been buried properly before the surviving settlers had voted to abandon their makeshift homestead and push west to Fort Collins. Just 3 hours earlier, wagon master Samuel Harrington had delivered his ultimatum with the callous efficiency of a man accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. He'd looked at Sarah's children, barely 4 months old, and shaken his grizzled head. "Mrs. Whitmore, those babies won't survive the journey. The crying will draw wolves, maybe worse. We can't risk 20 families for one." Sarah had pleaded, offering to muffle the children, to walk rather than ride, to give up her share of supplies. But the decision was final. As the last wagon pulled away, Samuel had tossed a small pouch of hardtack and jerky at her feet, like she was some stray dog being thrown scraps. "May God have mercy on you all," he'd muttered, not meeting her eyes. Now, as the temperature plummeted with each passing hour, Sarah surveyed her impossible situation. The nearest fort was 40 miles north through terrain she'd never navigated, with no horse, no provisions beyond what Samuel had thrown at her, and 2 infants who needed constant care. The settlers had taken everything useful, claiming they needed every resource for their own survival. The snow was already ankle-deep and falling harder. Sarah's practical frontier mind calculated grimly. They had perhaps 6 hours before hypothermia claimed them all. Her thin cotton dress and worn boots were pathetic armor against this winter assault. Robert's heavy coat had been taken by the settlers for a growing boy who needed it more, they'd said. Sarah pushed through the ruins of her home, searching for anything the scavengers had missed. In what had been their bedroom, she found a singed quilt buried under fallen timbers. It was damaged, but would provide some insulation. From the kitchen area, she managed to retrieve a small iron pot that hadn't been deemed worth taking. The twins stirred restlessly, their tiny fists pushing against her coat. Mary began to fuss, the soft mewling that would escalate to full cries. If Sarah didn't act quickly, she had perhaps 1 more feeding's worth of milk before her stressed, undernourished body could produce no more. After that. Before we continue this harrowing tale of survival, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment telling us which state you're watching from, and if this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow we have an extraordinary tale about a lost child and a mountain man that you won't want to miss. Sarah forced herself to think clearly. Robert had taught her some basic woodcraft before his death, though she'd never imagined she'd need such knowledge for survival rather than supplementing their garden. She remembered him saying that shelter was the first priority, then fire, then water. Looking around the devastated landscape, she spotted a stand of cottonwoods about a 1/4 mile from the ruins. The trees would provide some wind protection, and she might find dry wood beneath their canopy. With Jonathan sleeping and Mary growing more agitated, Sarah made the difficult trek across the frozen plain. Each step was agony. Her thin-soled boots provided no traction on the icy ground, and she slipped repeatedly, always terrified she'd fall on the babies. The wind seemed determined to strip away what little warmth remained in her body, and her hands had already lost feeling, despite being tucked inside her sleeves with the children. At the cottonwood grove, Sarah found what she'd hoped for, a natural windbreak where the trees created a small, relatively sheltered space. More importantly, she discovered a fallen log that had been partially hollowed by some long-gone animal. It wasn't much, but it could provide crucial protection for the twins. Working with hands she could barely feel, Sarah gathered armfuls of fallen branches and leaves. She stuffed the makeshift shelter with this insulation, creating a nest where she could place the babies while she attempted to build a fire. Her fingers were clumsy with cold as she tried to clear a spot for the fire, arranging stones in a circle as Robert had shown her. The real challenge was creating flame. The settlers had, of course, taken all matches and fire-starting supplies. Sarah remembered Robert demonstrating the bow drill method, but she'd never actually done it herself. She gathered dry wood from beneath the log, created what she hoped was adequate tinder from shredded bark and dead grass, and began the painstaking process of trying to generate enough friction for a spark. Time after time, her attempts failed. The bough kept slipping, her hands cramped with cold, and the wind scattered her carefully arranged tinder. Mary's fussing had escalated to crying, and Jonathan was beginning to stir. Sarah knew that once both babies were fully awake and hungry, any chance of creating fire would disappear. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Desperation drove her to a final, furious effort. She braced the bow drill against a stone and worked it with a determination born of absolute necessity. Smoke began to rise from the tinder bundle. Her heart leaped as she saw the first faint glow of an ember. Gently, desperately, she coaxed the ember into flame. The fire caught, small but real, its warmth immediately noticeable in the frigid air. Sarah nearly wept with relief as she fed it carefully with twigs, then larger branches, building it into something that might actually help them survive the night. With fire secured, she turned her attention to the twins. Both were crying now, their hunger overriding everything else. Sarah positioned herself near the fire and attempted to nurse them, her body struggling to produce milk under the extreme stress. Mary latched on eagerly, but Jonathan seemed weaker, his sucking less vigorous than usual. As she fed her children, Sarah forced herself to confront the terrible mathematics of survival. Even if they made it through this night, what then? She had no substantial food, no proper shelter, no protection from the wolves that howled in the distance. The temperature was dropping steadily, and this was only the beginning of winter. She thought of Robert's stories about the local tribes. The Sioux had burned their cabin, but there were others, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Comanche, who ranged through this territory. Most settlers spoke of these tribes with fear and hatred, but Robert had been different. He'd actually traded with some of them before his death, had spoken of their skill in surviving conditions that defeated white settlers. They read the land like a book, he'd told her. They know every plant that can be eaten, every sign of weather change, every animal track. If anyone could survive out here, it's them. At the time, Sarah had barely listened, focused on her pregnancy and domestic concerns. Now, those half-remembered conversations offered a strange comfort. Perhaps, if she were found by one of these tribes, they might show mercy. After all, she was obviously no threat, just a desperate woman with 2 babies. The fire crackled as she added another branch, its warmth barely holding back the encroaching cold. The twins had settled into an exhausted sleep, but Sarah knew she couldn't rest. She had to keep the fire going, had to stay alert for the wolves she could hear in the distance, had to figure out how to stretch their meager supplies. From the depths of her wool coat, she pulled out the jerky Samuel had left. It was tough, salted meat that would last longer than fresh food, but there were perhaps 10 pieces total. Shared between her and the children, she hoped to keep alive. Through her milk, it might sustain them for 3 days if they were careful. The night stretched endlessly ahead. Sarah had never felt so alone, so crushed by the weight of responsibility. These 2 tiny lives depended entirely on her, and she felt pathetically inadequate to the task. She'd been a schoolteacher before, marrying Robert, more comfortable with books than with the practical skills needed for frontier survival. But as she sat there, feeding wood to the fire and listening to her children's steady breathing, something shifted inside her. The despair was still there, but it was joined by something harder, more determined. She'd already survived the village, burning, Robert's death, and the abandonment by the settlers. She was still breathing, still thinking, still capable of action. The storm raged around their small pocket of warmth, but inside the makeshift shelter, life continued. Sarah began to sing softly, an old lullaby her own mother had sung to her in Massachusetts, back when the world was predictable and safe. Her voice was hoarse with cold, but the melody provided a kind of anchor against the chaos of the night. As the hours crept by, Sarah dozed fitfully, always jerking awake at the slightest sound. Once she saw eyes reflecting the firelight at the edge of their camp, wolf or coyote, she couldn't tell. She grabbed a burning branch and waved it, shouting hoarsely. The eyes disappeared, but she knew they'd return. Dawn was still hours away. When Sarah heard it, the sound that made her blood freeze, hoofbeats, multiple horses moving through the snow with the steady rhythm of experienced riders. Her first instinct was hope. Perhaps the settlers had returned for them, but as the sounds grew closer, she realized these weren't the metal-shod horses of white settlers. These were unshod horses, moving with the quiet efficiency of riders, who knew how to travel without announcing their presence. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled the twins closer. If these were Sioux returning to check on their handiwork, she and the children were as good as dead. But if they were from one of the other tribes Robert had mentioned, there might be a chance. Her knowledge of local tribal relations was limited, but she knew enough to understand that not all the Plains tribes were allied or shared the same attitudes toward white settlers. The hoofbeats stopped. Sarah held her breath, trying to make herself and the children invisible. Through the dying fire's glow, she saw shadows moving beyond the trees. These weren't casual travelers. They were being deliberately quiet, approaching with the caution of hunters. Then a voice spoke, low and commanding, in a language she didn't recognize. Other voices answered, and Sarah detected a tone of discussion, even argument. Were they debating what to do with the strange white woman and her children? A figure stepped into the firelight, and Sarah's heart stopped. He was tall and powerfully built, dressed in buffalo robes and winter leggings. His hair was long and braided with feathers, and his face was painted with designs that looked like war paint. Everything about him radiated authority and danger, but what struck Sarah most was his eyes. They weren't the cold, predatory gaze she'd expected. Instead, there was a kind of calculating assessment, as if he were measuring her worth in ways she couldn't understand. He spoke again, and another figure joined him, a younger man who also seemed to defer to the first. They looked at Sarah and the twins with expressions she couldn't read. Fear paralyzed her completely. She couldn't run, couldn't fight, couldn't even speak. The older man stepped closer, and Sarah could see the details of his regalia. The quality of his clothing, the ornate beadwork, the way the others deferred to him, all indicated high status. This wasn't just any warrior. This was a leader. He crouched down, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid startling her. When he spoke, his voice was deep and careful, the words clearly foreign but somehow not harsh. He gestured to the twins, then to Sarah, then to himself. Despite her terror, Sarah noticed something odd. His approach wasn't threatening. If he'd wanted to kill them, he could have done so easily. Instead, he seemed to be evaluating them. The man stood and turned to his companions, speaking rapidly in their language. Sarah caught occasional gestures in her direction and toward the babies. There was definitely disagreement among them. She could hear the tension in their voices, see it in their postures. Finally, the leader turned back to her. He reached into his robe and pulled out a bundle of what looked like dried meat. He placed it near the fire, then gestured to Sarah and the children again. His meaning seemed clear. Eat. Sarah stared at the offered food, her mind reeling. This was not how she'd been told these encounters went. Where was the violence, the scalping, the immediate danger? Instead, she was being offered sustenance by a man whose people were supposed to be her mortal enemies. The twins stirred, Mary beginning to fuss again. The sound seemed to affect the leader strongly. His expression changed, becoming softer somehow. He spoke to his companions, his tone now carrying a note of decision. One of the younger men protested, his voice rising sharply, but the leader silenced him with a gesture and a few sharp words. Authority had been asserted. Discussion was over. The leader looked at Sarah again, and this time she saw something that astonished her. Compassion. Without breaking eye contact, he reached for the bundle of meat and pushed it closer to her. Then he gestured to himself and said something that sounded like a name, Nahuel. Sarah understood. He was telling her his name. Tentatively, terrified, but with no other choice, she pointed to herself and whispered, Sarah. Then, looking down at her children, she said, Jonathan. Mary. Nahuel nodded gravely, as if filing this information away. He stood and turned to his men, issuing what sounded like a series of orders. The discussion that followed was brief but intense. Sarah caught the undercurrent of disagreement, possibly even anger from some of the younger warriors. But Nahuel's word was clearly final. He approached Sarah again, this time extending his hand in a gesture that seemed almost gentle. He spoke slowly, using gestures along with words she didn't understand. Yet somehow the meaning came through. Come with us. Sarah stared at the offered hand. Taking it would mean trusting her life and her children's lives to people she'd been taught to fear, but staying meant certain death. The choice, really, had already been made by the blizzard, by the settlers' abandonment, by the bitter mathematics of survival. She reached out and took Nahuel's hand. His grip was firm but gentle as he helped her to her feet. The twins, wrapped in their makeshift bundle of rags, seemed impossibly small and vulnerable as Sarah lifted them. One of the younger warriors brought forward a horse blanket, heavy and warm. Nahuel took it and wrapped it around Sarah and the children, his movements careful and practiced. He spoke to her again, his tone reassuring despite the language barrier. As the other warriors prepared to leave, securing Sarah and the twins on one of the horses with Nahuel himself, she felt a strange mix of terror and relief. She was placing her life in the hands of strangers whose culture, language, and intentions she couldn't fully understand. But as they rode away from the dying fire and into the storm, with Nahuel's strong arm keeping her and the children secure against his chest, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected. Safety. For the first time since Robert's death, someone with strength and authority was taking responsibility for their survival. The blizzard seemed less threatening now, the darkness less absolute. Whatever came next, whatever challenges awaited them, in Nahuel's world, it had to be better than dying alone in the snow. As they disappeared into the white wilderness, carrying a frontier widow and 2 infants toward an uncertain but hopeful future, Sarah whispered a prayer of gratitude into the howling wind. They were alive. Against all odds, they were alive. The journey through the blizzard felt like traveling through a frozen dream. Sarah had lost all sense of time and direction as Nahuel's horse picked its way through the deep snow with an uncanny ability to find secure footing. The twins remained mercifully quiet, perhaps sensing the gravity of their situation or simply exhausted from their ordeal. Sarah could feel Nahuel's steady breathing behind her, his body shielding her and the children from the worst of the wind. As dawn began to paint the sky in pale greys and purples, the storm finally began to weaken. Through the gradually clearing snow, Sarah caught her first glimpse of their destination, a village of teepees arranged in a careful pattern, protected by a natural windbreak of boulders and stunted trees. Smoke rose from the camp, creating a beacon of warmth and life in the desolate landscape. The sight of the camp brought a flood of emotions Sarah wasn't prepared for. Relief at finally reaching shelter was mixed with terror at what her reception might be. These people had taken her in, but what did that mean? Was she a prisoner, a guest, a curiosity to be examined, and then discarded? As they rode closer, figures emerged from the teepees. Women wrapped in beautiful blankets, their long hair braided with feathers and beads. Children who pointed excitedly at the approaching riders. Warriors who stood alert but calm, their hands resting on weapons but not threatening. Nahuel called, out as they entered the camp, his voice carrying authority and command. Sarah heard her name spoken amid the foreign words. He was announcing their arrival, explaining her presence. The response was immediate and varied. Some voices sounded welcoming, others questioning, a few distinctly hostile. They stopped before the largest teepee in the center of the camp. Nahuel dismounted first, then carefully helped Sarah down, making sure she maintained her grip on the twins. Her legs nearly buckled after hours in the saddle, but Nahuel steadied her with practiced ease. An elderly woman emerged from the central teepee, her movement dignified despite her age. Her clothing was elaborate, every surface decorated with intricate beadwork and quill work. But it was her eyes that caught Sarah's attention, intelligent, assessing, but not unkind. This woman was clearly someone of importance, perhaps Nahuel's mother or grandmother. She approached slowly, studying Sarah and the twins with penetrating attention. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years and wisdom, each word carefully chosen. Nahuel responded with obvious respect, gesturing frequently towards Sarah and the children. The conversation that followed seemed to be a kind of explanation or negotiation. Sarah caught her name again and the names of her children. At one point, Nahuel pulled back the blanket to show the elderly woman the twins' faces. The woman's expression softened dramatically when she saw the babies. She reached out tentative fingers to touch Mary's tiny hand, then spoke rapidly to Nahuel. Whatever she said seemed to settle something important, because several of the warriors who had been standing tense relaxed noticeably. Suddenly, the woman was in motion. She clapped her hands sharply, issuing orders that sent people scurrying in different directions. Within moments, younger women were approaching with armloads of warm blankets, steaming bowls of food, and what looked like children's clothing. Sarah found herself gently but firmly guided into the central teepee. The interior was a revelation. Warm, spacious, and beautifully decorated, buffalo hides covered the ground, painted with intricate designs. A fire burned in the center, its smoke drawing up through an opening at the top. The elderly woman, who Sarah learned was called Grandmother Dove when Nahuel spoke her name, immediately began fussing over the twins. Her movement spoke of long experience with children as she examined them for signs of frostbite or illness. Sarah watched in amazement as this woman, who had never seen them before, treated her children with the care of a devoted relative. Grandmother. Dove made soft, clicking sounds as she checked Jonathan's hands and feet, her face showing concern at his weakness. She spoke to one of the younger women, who immediately left the teepee. What happened next changed something fundamental in Sarah's understanding of these people. The young woman returned, carrying a baby, roughly the same age as Sarah's twins. Behind her came another new mother, her expression sympathetic as she understood what was being asked of her. Without hesitation, the Comanche woman sat beside Sarah and began to nurse Jonathan alongside her own child. The generosity of this gesture, sharing her own baby's sustenance with a stranger's child, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Grandmother Dove seemed to interpret Sarah's tears correctly. She reached out and patted Sarah's arm, her weathered face creasing in what was unmistakably a smile of understanding and acceptance. Food was placed before Sarah, a rich stew that warmed her from the inside out, some kind of flat bread, and tea made from herbs she didn't recognize. As she ate, women continued to come and go, bringing warm clothing that had been quickly altered to fit her, soft blankets for the twins, and various remedies for the minor frostbite that marked her fingers and toes. Through it all, Nahuel remained, present but did not dominate the proceedings. Sarah watched him interact with the others and began to understand his role in the community. The way people approached him, the deference they showed, the way conflicts were brought to him for resolution. This was not just a war chief, but someone equivalent to a town mayor or even a territorial governor. As the day progressed, Sarah's initial terror began to transform into something more complex. These people had taken her in during a blizzard, shared their food and warmth, cared for her children as if they were their own. Where were the scalping, knives, the torture, the savage behavior she'd been warned about all her life? Instead, she found a highly organized society with clear rules about hospitality and care for the vulnerable. When an older woman slipped on ice outside the teepee, young people immediately rushed to help her. When two children began arguing over a toy, an adult intervened with patient mediation rather than harsh punishment. Late in the afternoon, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Runners had arrived from one of the outlying camps, and their news caused immediate concern. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she could read the tension in every adult face. Nahuel listened to the runners' report with growing grimness. When they finished, he turned to address the assembled adults, his voice carrying authority and command. Though Sarah couldn't understand the specifics, the general meaning was clear. There was trouble coming, and decisions needed to be made. The discussion that followed was intense but orderly. Different people stood to speak, making what appeared to be various arguments or suggestions. Throughout it all, Sarah noticed how even the youngest adults were allowed to voice their opinions, how women spoke with the same authority as men, how consensus was built rather than imposed. Finally, Nahuel stood again. When he spoke this time, there was finality in his voice. Decisions had been made. Several warriors nodded and immediately left the teepee, presumably to carry out orders. Grandmother Dove approached Sarah and, through a combination of gestures and simple words, explained what had been decided. Tomorrow, the main camp would be moving to winter quarters deeper in the protected valleys. Sarah and her children would go with them. But there was more. Grandmother Dove pointed to Nahuel, then to Sarah, then made a gesture that seemed to encompass the twins. She spoke a word several times, trying to make Sarah understand its meaning. Finally, one of the younger women who had some English words learned. From previous contact with traders, helped translate. Adopt, she said carefully. Chief, adopt, children. Sarah stared at Nahuel, unsure she had understood correctly. He approached and sat beside her, his manner serious but not threatening. In broken English mixed with gestures, he explained. His own children had died in a disease outbreak 3 winters ago. His wife had died in childbirth the previous spring, taking their unborn child with her. The twins reminded him of his own lost babies. In his grief and their need, he saw a path forward for all of them. The Comanche way, he explained, was to adopt children who had lost their parents, to bring them fully into the tribe as if they had been born into it. Sarah's children would be his children, with all the protection and status that entailed. But what about her? Sarah managed to ask through the translator. Nahuel's answer was careful and respectful. She could remain as the children's mother, with a place of honor in his household, or she could choose to return to her own people when the weather improved. The choice was hers. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. These people weren't just saving her children's lives, they were offering them a future, an identity, a place in a world that valued them. As evening fell, and the camp prepared for sleep, Sarah found herself reflecting on the extraordinary day. This morning she had expected to die with her children in the snow. Now she lay warm and fed in a teepee that smelled of sage and wood smoke, her twins sleeping peacefully beside her. The questions that would shape their future could wait for tomorrow. Tonight, for the first time since the attack on her homestead, Sarah felt truly safe. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she and her children were no longer alone against the world. Before she slept, Sarah managed a few words of gratitude to Grandmother Dove and Nahuel. They didn't need translation. The emotion was universal. As she drifted off, she heard the soft sounds of a lullaby being hummed nearby, a Comanche mother singing her child to sleep just as mothers had always done, in every culture, since the beginning of time. The blizzard that had nearly killed them became a bridge to a new life. The storm that had been their enemy had revealed the kindness of strangers who were no longer strange. In choosing survival over prejudice, Sarah had found something she never expected among people she'd been taught to fear: acceptance, compassion, and the possibility of belonging. The winter camp proved to be far more elaborate than Sarah had imagined. As the tribe moved to their protected valley, she discovered a network of permanent structures alongside the portable teepees, semi-underground lodges built of stone and timber, ingeniously designed to conserve heat, elevated granaries that kept food stores safe from flooding and pests, even a system of reflective panels made from polished metal that directed sunlight into the most sheltered areas. Sarah marveled at the engineering intelligence displayed in every aspect of the camp's design. These weren't the primitive savages described in frontier newspapers, but people who had mastered their environment in ways that white settlers had never bothered to learn. The twins thrived in this new environment. Jonathan, who had been failing to gain weight, began to plump, up under the care of multiple nursing mothers. Mary became the darling of the camp children, who took turns watching over her with a responsibility that impressed Sarah. In white settlements, children were often seen as burdens. Here they were treasured as the future of the people. Nahuel had kept his promise about adoption, but the process involved more ceremony than Sarah had expected. A week after their arrival, he invited her to witness a formal council meeting where the twins' status would be officially recognized. The ceremony began at dawn, on a day when the winter sky blazed with unusual colors. The entire community gathered in a circle around a central fire that had been built up to impressive heights. Elders from different bands within the tribe took turns speaking, each recounting the laws and customs governing adoption. Grandmother Dove had spent hours the previous evening preparing Sarah and the twins for the ceremony. The children wore tiny outfits of white deerskin decorated with symbols Sarah was told meant new beginning and protected ones. Sarah herself wore borrowed finery, a dress of soft leather adorned with beadwork that told the story of the tribe's origins. When the moment came for the actual adoption, Nahuel stepped forward carrying Jonathan, while Sarah held Mary. He spoke in Comanche, his voice carrying across the silent gathering. Then, to Sarah's surprise, he switched to English for the next part. I, running wolf of the Quahada Comanche, take these children as my own blood. Their past suffering becomes their strength. Their future is ours. Let no one question their place among us. Running Wolf. Sarah realized this was Nahuel's full name, or perhaps his English translation. The formal sound of it emphasized the magnitude of what was happening. An elder approached, carrying a bowl of red clay mixed with sacred herbs. Nahuel dipped his fingers into the mixture and made symbolic marks on the twins' foreheads, then on Sarah's, then on his own. The marks, Grandmother Dove whispered to Sarah, connected them as family for all time. The ceremony concluded with the entire community pledging their protection to the newly adopted children. One by one, adults approached to touch the twins gently, speaking a word or phrase that sounded like a blessing or promise. But the ceremony revealed something else beyond the adoption. As various speakers took their turns, Sarah began to understand, through gestures and the few translated phrases, that larger decisions were being made. The band was planning something, a major move or action that went beyond their normal winter activities. After the ceremony, as people began to disperse, Running Wolf approached Sarah with a serious expression. Through a combination of his broken English and the young woman who often translated, he explained the situation that had been troubling the camp. Sarah's former companions, the settlers who had abandoned her, had reached Fort Collins and reported a fantastic tale. According to them, a white woman and her children had been captured by Comanche raiders. They'd embellished the story dramatically, claiming to have fought valiantly to save her before being overwhelmed by superior numbers. The commanding officer at Fort Collins, Major Harrison Blake, was now planning a winter expedition to rescue Sarah and punish the Comanche band that had taken her. The runners who had brought this news estimated the soldiers would arrive within 2 weeks. Running Wolf's council had voted to move the camp immediately to more defensible ground deeper in the mountains. But he had also made a personal decision that shocked the entire band. He wanted to take Sarah back to Fort Collins himself to tell the truth about what had really happened. The suggestion caused an immediate uproar among the warriors. Taking Sarah to the fort would expose the location of their winter camps. It would put Running Wolf himself at tremendous risk. White soldiers were not known for their willingness to listen to Comanche explanations, but Running Wolf's logic was unshakable. "If soldiers come here looking for captured white woman," he explained slowly in English, "many die. Maybe women and children die. If I bring you to soldiers, tell them you chose to stay. Maybe they listen. Maybe they leave us in peace." Sarah felt the weight of the entire community's future settling on her shoulders. They had saved her life, accepted her children, offered her a place among them. Now their survival might depend on her willingness to return to the world that had cast her out. The debate continued for hours. Some argued that no good could come from trusting white soldiers. Others pointed out that Running Wolf's status as a chief might protect him during such a negotiation. A few suggested that Sarah go alone without risking their leader. Through all the discussion, Sarah remained silent, processing the magnitude of what was being asked. Return to Fort Collins meant facing the very people who had abandoned her to die. It meant defending the honor of those who had shown her kindness against those who had betrayed her. But as she watched the camp around her, children playing, women weaving, men repairing weapons while telling stories, she understood what her choice had to be. These people had taken her in when she had nothing, had claimed her children as their own, had given her dignity and purpose. How could she do anything less than risk everything to protect them? That evening, Sarah found herself alone with Running Wolf and Grandmother Dove. Through careful translation and simple English, she expressed her decision. "I'll go with you to the fort," she said. "I'll tell them the truth." Running Wolf's face remained impassive, but Sarah caught the relief that flickered in his eyes. Grandmother Dove nodded approvingly and squeezed Sarah's hand. "But," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, "I have conditions." Running Wolf listened intently as she explained. If they were going to face the soldiers, they needed proof of their story that couldn't be dismissed as the lies of an Indian corrupted woman. She asked for time to write down everything that had happened, from the moment the settlers abandoned her to her rescue by Running Wolf. She wanted witnesses from the camp to accompany them, people who could verify the timeline and circumstances of her rescue. Most importantly, she wanted to ensure the twins remained safe in the camp, rather than risk exposing them to the unpredictable situation at the fort. Running Wolf agreed to all her conditions. The next 5 days passed in intensive preparation. Sarah worked with one of the few band members who could write English to craft a careful document explaining the true sequence of events. They gathered testimonies from those who had witnessed her arrival and condition, from the women who had nursed her children back to health, from anyone who could provide credible evidence of the band's humanitarian actions. Word of Sarah's decision spread through the camp, and the response was overwhelming. People who had initially been suspicious of the white woman now came forward to offer support. Warriors volunteered to escort them to the fort. Women pressed small gifts upon her, protective amulets, honey for the journey, carefully made moccasins that would withstand the travel. The night before their departure, the band held a ceremony for Sarah that she hadn't expected. As the community gathered around the central fire, Grandmother Dove stood to address them. She spoke in Comanche, but the translator helped Sarah understand the essence of her words. This white woman had come to them in need, and they had answered that need. Now she was answering theirs, risking her own safety to protect their community. Such courage, such loyalty, was the truest mark of belonging to the people. Then came the surprise. Grandmother Dove announced that Sarah had been given a Comanche name, Chiskanaye, little eagle who protects the nest. The name, she explained, honored Sarah's fierce defense of her children and her willingness to fly far from safety to protect those who had sheltered her. As the meaning of this honor settled over the gathering, Sarah felt a transformation within herself. 6 months ago, she had been Sarah Whitmore, dispensable widow barely tolerated by her own people. Now she was Chiskanaye, recognized warrior and protector of a community that valued her courage. The journey to Fort Collins began before dawn in a crystalline cold that turned breath to instant fog. Running Wolf led a party of 6 warriors, Sarah and 2 women who would serve as witnesses and translators. Everyone was armed and alert. While they traveled under a flag of truce, they knew that the reputation for honoring such things varied greatly among frontier military commanders. As they rode through the dawn, Sarah found herself thinking not of the dangers ahead, but of the transformation behind her. The woman who had been left to die in the snow was gone. In her place rode someone who had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed, who had found family among strangers, who had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. The first day of travel passed without incident, but on the second day they encountered the first patrol from Fort Collins. The soldiers' reaction was immediate and tense. Rifles were raised, orders shouted, demands made that the captive be released immediately. Sarah rode forward, holding her peace document visibly. In clear, firm voice, she announced, "I am Sarah. Whitmore, I was not captured by these people. I was rescued by them. I demand to speak with your commanding officer." The patrol leader, a young lieutenant named Morrison, looked confused and suspicious. This well-dressed woman who spoke with educated authority didn't match his image of a terrorized captive. The Comanche warriors surrounding her showed no signs of coercion. If anything, they appeared to be protecting her rather than holding her prisoner. After heated discussion among the soldiers, Morrison agreed to escort them to the fort under guard. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She, who had been offered complete freedom by the Comanche, now found herself under armed escort by her own countrymen. Fort Collins appeared ahead of them, its wooden walls and military precision a stark contrast to the organic flow of the Comanche camp. As they approached the gates, Sarah steeled herself for what she knew would be the fight of her life, not for physical survival, but for the survival of truth in a world built on comfortable lies. The gates opened to admit them, and Sarah rode into the fort carrying more than just her own story. She carried the hopes of a people who had shown her more kindness than her own race ever had. She carried proof that humanity transcended the artificial boundaries of race and culture. She carried truth powerful enough to challenge everything. These soldiers believed about the people they were preparing to fight. Behind the fort's walls waited Major Blake and the settlers who had abandoned her. Sarah drew on every ounce of courage the Comanche had helped her discover. This was her moment to stand between two worlds and speak truth to power. As she dismounted in the fort's courtyard, Sarah felt the weight of history on her shoulders. What happened in the next few hours would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of the people who had become her true family. The widow, who had been cast out, had become a bridge between worlds, and the strength to bear that responsibility had been forged in the very places where she had suffered most. The confrontation that would change everything was about to begin. The fort's main building loomed before Sarah as she walked between armed guards, Running Wolf and his delegation following under heavy escort. Major Blake had assembled quite an audience. Practically every officer in the fort, several civilian leaders from nearby settlements, and most prominently Samuel Harrington and 3 other members of the wagon train that had abandoned her months ago. Sarah saw recognition flicker across Harrington's weathered face, followed quickly by something that looked like fear. He leaned over to whisper urgently to the man beside him, gesturing toward her. Whatever lies they'd constructed about her capture were about to be tested against the truth. Major Blake was a stern man in his 50s, his uniform immaculate despite the frontier conditions. He studied Sarah with sharp eyes, clearly trying to reconcile the composed, well-dressed woman before him with the stories of a traumatized captive. He'd been told, "Mrs. Whitmore," he began, his voice carrying military authority, "we're relieved to see you alive. We understand you've been held prisoner by these people for several months. Can you tell us about your ordeal?" Sarah looked around the room, making eye contact with each person present, but lingering longest on the settlers who had left her to die. "Major Blake," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I have indeed been living with the Comanche for these past months, but I was never a prisoner. I was a refugee who was saved from certain death." A murmur of confusion and disbelief rippled through the room. Harrington stepped forward, his face flushed. "That's Stockholm Syndrome talking, Major. She's been brainwashed. We saw the raid." "You saw nothing of the kind," Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through his words like a blade, "because you were already 3 miles away when Running Wolf found me freezing to death with my twins." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah reached into her coat and withdrew the carefully prepared document, along with several smaller papers. "I have here a complete account of what actually happened, written in my own hand. I also have testimony from dozens of witnesses who can verify every detail." Major Blake motioned for her to approach, taking the papers with obvious skepticism. As he read, his expression changed from doubt to surprise to something approaching anger. When he looked up, his gaze was fixed on Harrington. "According to this account, Mrs. Whitmore, you were deliberately abandoned during a blizzard. Is that correct?" Sarah nodded solemnly. "I was told, in the presence of multiple witnesses, that my children and I would slow down the wagon train, and that we had to be left behind. We were given a small amount of food and told to, 'May God have mercy on us.'" Harrington stepped forward again, desperation creeping into his voice. "She's been turned against her own kind. Can't you see that? Those savages have Those people, Sarah interrupted, her voice rising with indignation, saved my children's lives when you condemned them to death. Those people fed us, clothed us, protected us, and asked nothing in return. Those people treated my children as their own, while you treated us as disposable burdens. Running Wolf, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, stepped forward. In careful English, he addressed Major Blake. "I ask permission to speak." The Major nodded, his interest clearly piqued. Running Wolf continued, "Your people say I take white woman prisoner. This is lie. I find white woman and babies dying in snow, crying, starving. I bring to my people. We give food, warm clothes, medicine. We save lives your people leave to die." The simplicity and honesty of his statement resonated throughout the room. One of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably. "Major," he said quietly, "if what they're saying is true—" "It is true," Sarah said firmly. She then called forward the Comanche women who had accompanied them, asking them to show the items they'd brought as proof. Carefully preserved pieces of the torn, blood-stained clothing she'd worn when found. Testimony written by the camp's medicine women about the children's condition upon arrival. Even a lock of hair from Jonathan's head, kept as was customary when a child's life was saved. But the most powerful evidence came when Sarah rolled up her sleeves, revealing the scars on her hands and arms, not from Comanche captivity, but from the night she'd tried desperately to start a fire while her children cried in the cold. Grandmother Dove stepped forward and, through the translator, described in detail how those injuries had been treated, how the woman they now called Chiska Naye had fought like a mother wolf to keep her children alive. As the evidence mounted, the mood in the room shifted dramatically. Even the hardest soldiers seemed moved by the testimony. Major Blake's anger at being deceived was becoming more apparent with each revelation. "Mr. Harrington," the Major said, finally, his voice cold with contained fury, "would you care to explain why my soldiers are preparing for a winter campaign based on what appears to be a complete fabrication?" Harrington looked around wildly, searching for support that wasn't coming. "The raid! There was a raid! They burned the settlement!" "That raid was conducted by the Sioux," Sarah stated clearly. "My husband Robert was killed in that attack. But Running Wolf and his people had nothing to do with it. They found me 3 days later, after you had abandoned us." At this point, one of the other settlers stepped forward, a woman Sarah recognized as Mrs. Patterson. "Samuel," she said quietly, "you told us she was taken by hostiles." "She was," Harrington protested. "As good as taken." "No," said another voice. Sarah was surprised to see young Tommy Brennan, one of the single men from the wagon train, step forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, I was there when Mr. Harrington made the decision. I tried to argue, but—" He looked ashamed. "He said it was them or us, and that was that." The admission broke the dam of Harrington's deception. One by one, other members of the wagon train confirmed parts of Sarah's story. Yes, they had known about the abandoned family. Yes, they had been told it was necessary for the greater good. Yes, they had lived with the guilt ever since. Major Blake's face grew darker with each confirmation. When the last witness had spoken, he stood in silence for a long moment. Then, in a voice that promised consequences, he addressed Harrington. "Mr. Harrington, you have wasted military resources, endangered my men with a pointless winter expedition, and caused me to nearly precipitate an unnecessary war with people who were acting as good Samaritans. I want you and your fellow conspirators out of this fort within the hour. You'll receive no further military protection or support from this command." But Sarah wasn't finished. "Major Blake," she said, "there's something else you need to know. Running Wolf and his people are willing to make peace. They want to coexist peacefully with white settlers. They've shown more Christian charity than any of the actual Christians I've encountered." This statement caused another stir, but Sarah continued, "I've lived with these people. I've seen their daily lives, their values, their genuine kindness. They could have killed me or enslaved me. Instead, they made me family. They're not the monsters you've been told about." Running Wolf nodded to his companions, and one of them brought forward a bundle. "We bring gift," he announced. "Proof of peace." The bundle contained beautifully crafted items: a rifle decorated with intricate beadwork for the major, knives with carved handles for his officers, and a magnificent blanket depicting scenes of buffalo hunts and peaceful camps. But the most significant item was a pipe, a ceremonial peace pipe that Running Wolf offered to Major Blake. "We smoke together," Running Wolf explained. "We make peace between our peoples. No more war, no more raids on either side." Major Blake accepted the pipe with obvious surprise and growing respect. "You're offering a formal peace treaty?" "More than treaty," Running Wolf replied. "We offer friendship, trade, understanding. Your people need learn how to live on this land. We know this land for many generations. We share knowledge. Everyone benefits." The major looked around the room, studying the faces of his officers. Then he looked at Sarah. "Mrs. Whitmore, you've chosen to live with these people. Will you continue to do so?" Sarah nodded without hesitation. "They are my family now. My children are being raised as Comanche children, but they'll know their white heritage too. I'm teaching them to read and write in English. The Comanche children are learning these skills too. We're building a bridge between two worlds." One of the younger officers spoke up. "Mrs. Whitmore, surely you miss your own kind?" Sarah's laugh was soft but firm. "Officer, these people became my kind the moment they showed more humanity than those who shared my blood. Kindness doesn't have a color. Compassion doesn't speak just one language." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything the fort had seen. Major Blake accepted the peace pipe, and together with Running Wolf, they performed the ritual of smoking it, a sacred act that bound both parties to their commitments. During the negotiations that followed, Sarah served as translator and mediator. Her unique position, trusted by both sides, made her invaluable. The agreement they hammered out was groundbreaking. Established trading posts where goods could be exchanged peacefully, protocols for dealing with disputes, and most importantly, mutual protection agreements against common threats like hostile raiding bands from other regions. But the most remarkable part of the agreement was the cultural exchange program Sarah proposed. Young people from both communities would spend time with the other, learning languages, skills, and ways of life. White children would learn how to read the land, track game, and survive in the wilderness. Comanche children would learn reading, writing, and new technologies that could benefit their people. As the formal proceedings concluded, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. She had come full circle, from being cast out by one community to being instrumental in building peace between two communities. That evening, as they prepared to return to the Comanche camp, Major Blake approached Sarah privately. "Mrs. Whitmore, or should I say, Chiska Naye, you've accomplished something remarkable here. You've turned personal tragedy into something that could benefit hundreds, possibly thousands of people." Sarah smiled, thinking of the twins who were waiting for her at the camp. "Major, I learned something from my ordeal. The worst things that happen to us can become the foundation for the best things we do. My abandonment led me to people who showed me what real family means. My suffering taught me strength I never knew I had. My loss became their gain, and their gain became mine." The major nodded thoughtfully. "You're going back to them." "I'm going home," Sarah corrected gently. "I'm going back to the people who chose me when I had nothing to offer them. I'm returning to children who call me mother, not because they have to, but because I've earned that title. I'm going back to a community that judges people by their character, not their skin color." As they rode away from Fort Collins the next morning, Sarah looked back once at the wooden walls that represented everything she'd been taught to value: order, civilization, safety within familiar boundaries. Then she turned toward the open, land ahead, toward the camp where her true family waited, toward a future built on understanding rather than fear. The widow who had been left to die in the snow had become a bridge between worlds. The mother who had feared for her children's survival had given them something beyond mere life. She'd given them a place in two cultures, a heritage that spanned racial boundaries, a legacy of peace that would ripple forward through generations. Running Wolf rode beside her, and in comfortable silence they headed home. Behind them lay a past of abandonment and prejudice. Ahead lay a future where a white woman and a Comanche chief had proven that the human heart recognizes no boundaries. When it comes to compassion, courage, and the fierce love that transforms strangers into family. As they reached the first ridge before descending into their valley, Sarah whispered a prayer of gratitude, not just for survival, but for transformation. The blizzard that had nearly killed them had revealed the greatest truth of all, that family is not about blood alone, but about the bonds we choose to forge when we dare to trust in the goodness of human hearts. And in that choices, in that trust, in that transformation from victim to bridge builder, lay the most powerful message of all, that our greatest trials can become our greatest gifts if we have the courage to embrace the unexpected kindness of strangers and the wisdom to recognize that love transcends all the boundaries humans create. Their children would grow up knowing both worlds, speaking both languages, bridging both cultures, and perhaps in their generation, the artificial divisions that had caused so much suffering would finally begin to heal. That was Sarah's gift. To the future, proof that even in the darkest times, even in the deepest snow, even in the face of abandonment and despair, the human spirit can find warmth, can discover family, can build bridges where others see only walls. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. She was no longer just a widow left to die. She was a mother who had found life beyond anything she could have imagined. And as they disappeared into the valley where children of two cultures played together in the snow, where women of different races shared the work and the wisdom of raising the next generation, where men who had once been enemies now planned a future based on mutual respect, the story became more than just Sarah's story. It became a testament to the power of seeing past differences to the shared humanity beneath. It became proof that the greatest strength comes not from standing alone, but from joining hands across the divides that others insist are unbridgeable. And it became a promise that even the coldest winter cannot freeze the warmth of hearts open to compassion, the hope of communities built on understanding, and the joy of families formed not by accident of birth, but by deliberate acts of love. This was the legacy of the widow in the snow. Not just survival, but transformation. Not just rescue, but redemption. Not just a second chance at life, but a chance to create a better world for all their children. 2 years had passed since the peace treaty at Fort Collins, and the Comanche camp had transformed into something unprecedented in the American frontier. A thriving community where two cultures had genuinely merged into something entirely new. Sarah, now fluent in Comanche and fully integrated into tribal leadership as Chiska Naye, stood at the edge of the camp watching her 4-year-old twins play with children of all backgrounds in the golden light of late afternoon. Jonathan and Mary were perfect embodiments of the new world being created. They switched effortlessly between English and Comanche, could track a rabbit through tall grass, or recite multiplication tables with equal skill. Mary wore her hair in the traditional Comanche braids adorned with colored beads, while Jonathan carried both a tomahawk his Comanche grandfather had made for him, and a wooden sword carved by one of the Irish settlers who had joined the community. The peace agreement had attracted unexpected followers. White families, disillusioned with the harsh realities of frontier settlement, began arriving, seeking the protection and prosperity of Running Wolf's band. former soldiers, seeking adventure and opportunity beyond military life, came to trade and stayed to learn. Even escaped slaves found sanctuary here, welcomed as people judged by their character rather than their origins. Sarah's role had evolved far beyond what anyone could have imagined. She had become Running Wolf's chief advisor on white relations, but more importantly, she had created the first formal school on the plains, an institution where children of all races learned side by side. Her classroom was a large teepee in the center of camp where English, Comanche, arithmetic, tracking skills, traditional stories, and practical survival knowledge were all part of the curriculum. The morning of this particular autumn day had brought news that would test everything they had built. A delegation from Washington was arriving, not soldiers this time, but government officials sent to investigate the unprecedented racial mixing that scouts had reported from the territory. Running Wolf called a council meeting as soon as the runners brought word. Sarah joined him in the central lodge, where the band's leaders gathered in a circle that now included white settlers, Mexican traders, a former Buffalo soldier named Marcus Johnson, and even Isabella Garcia, a Spanish woman who had fled an abusive marriage and found refuge among the Comanche. "The white grandfather in Washington is curious about our people," Running Wolf announced, using the Comanche term for the president. "They send men to see what we have built here." Thomas Mackenzie, a Scottish trader who had become one of the community's most valuable members, spoke first. "My brother serves in the territorial government. He says there are men in Washington who view our success as dangerous. They fear if others see what we've accomplished, it will challenge their ideas about how the West should be settled." Sarah felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. The peace they had built was fragile, dependent on being left alone to prove that their way of life was sustainable. Government interference could destroy everything. "What do they want?" asked Isabella Garcia, her voice carrying the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust official delegations. "Information," Running Wolf replied. "They want to understand how we govern ourselves, how we resolve conflicts between different peoples, how we maintain peace with traditional enemies." Marcus Johnson, the former Buffalo soldier, whose military experience gave him unique insights, leaned forward. "In my experience, when the government sends investigators instead of soldiers, they're either planning to copy what you're doing or destroy it. The question is, which one is it this time?" Sarah stood to address the council, her position as Running Wolf's co-leader now formally recognized by all. "We have a choice," she said, her voice carrying the authority earned through 2 years of proven judgment. "We can hide what we are and hope they lose interest, or we can show them the truth and trust that the strength of our example will speak for itself." Grandmother Dove, now nearing 90 but still sharp as flint, spoke from her place of honor. "When I was young, my grandmother told me of the first white men who came to our lands. They made promises they did not keep, treaties they broke, words that meant nothing. But these ones," she gestured towards Sarah and the other white members, "these ones kept their word. Perhaps it is time for truth." The debate continued for hours, with each member offering perspectives shaped by their unique experiences. Finally, Running Wolf stood to make the decision that would define their future. "We will meet them openly," he declared. "We will show them our children learning together, our fields growing food for all, our people living in peace. If they choose to see strength instead of threat, wisdom instead of chaos, then perhaps something good will come. If not..." He touched the knife at his belt meaningfully. "We are still strong enough to protect what we have built." Over the next 3 days, the community prepared for the delegation's arrival. But this wasn't a frantic attempt to hide their true nature. Instead, they doubled down on displaying their achievements. Children practiced demonstrations of their multilingual skills. The various craft workers prepared exhibitions of their finest works. The hunters organized displays of the sustainable practices that had allowed the band to thrive without depleting local resources. Sarah worked with a team of community leaders to prepare a formal presentation that would explain their governmental structure. It was unlike anything in American political science, a system that blended Comanche consensus-building traditions with democratic principles, military hierarchy with tribal elder wisdom. The delegation arrived on a crisp October morning, 6 men in official capacities, escorted by a troop of cavalry. Leading them was Commissioner James Blackwood, a man Sarah recognized from newspaper illustrations as one of the architects of Indian policy in Washington. What followed challenged every expectation on both sides. Commissioner Blackwood had come prepared to document either a failure of racial mixing or a dangerous challenge to white supremacy. Instead, he found something that defied categorization. The delegation was greeted not with the choreographed pageantry they expected, but with genuine daily life continuing around them. They saw white children learning to make arrows while teaching arithmetic to Comanche playmates. They watched Mexican farmers sharing irrigation techniques with former soldiers. They observed former enemies working side by side in perfect harmony. During the formal welcoming ceremony, Sarah stood beside Running Wolf as equal partners, translating not just words, but concepts between cultures that were still learning to understand each other. Commissioner Blackwood's eyes kept returning to her, clearly struggling to categorize this confident woman who commanded respect from warriors and settlers alike. "Commissioner Blackwood," Sarah said when the formalities were complete, "you've come to see something unprecedented. Please, let us show you what's possible when people choose cooperation over conquest." The tour that followed was a revelation. They visited the school where children recited lessons in 3 languages. They saw the medical lodge where a former army surgeon worked alongside a traditional Comanche healer, combining the best of both healing traditions. They observed the council sessions where disputes were resolved through discussion rather than force, where every adult, regardless of background, had a voice in community decisions. But the most powerful moment came when they visited the memorial. Sarah had created for her husband Robert and Running Wolf's first family. It was a medicine wheel built of stones, with plaques in multiple languages honoring all who had died before the peace was achieved. "This is where we remember why we built something different," Sarah explained, her voice thick with emotion. "Every stone represents a life lost to fear, hatred, and misunderstanding. My husband died in a senseless raid. Running Wolf's children died from diseases brought by white settlers. We could have used these losses to justify more violence. Instead, we chose to honor them by proving that another way was possible." Commissioner Blackwood stood in silence, studying the memorial. Finally, he spoke. "Mrs. Whitmore, forgive me, Chiska Nayi. This is not what we expected to find." "What did you expect?" Sarah asked gently. "Honestly, chaos. Either a breakdown of civilized order or some kind of... I'm not sure what we thought we'd find, but not this, not something that actually works." That evening, the delegation was invited to participate in a community feast. Sarah watched with amusement as Commissioner Blackwood struggled with chopsticks, taught to him by one of the Chinese immigrants who had joined their community, while his aide learned a Comanche drinking song from Isabella Garcia. During the feast, Running Wolf stood to address their guests. "You come to observe our people," he began, speaking in English out of respect for their visitors. "We welcome you. But we ask that you understand. We are not experiment. We are not curiosity. We are family. Different colors, different languages, different beliefs, but one family." He gestured around the gathered crowd. "2 winters ago, white women and children came to us dying. We could let them die. But our way says all children are precious, all mothers deserve protection. We saved them because it was right thing to do. Now this woman is our heart. Her children are our future. This is not strange thing. This is human thing. Commissioner Blackwood stood to respond. Chief Running Wolf, I came here with preconceived notions about what we would find. I won't lie. There are many in Washington who see interracial communities as a threat to order, but what I see here is not chaos. It's the most orderly, prosperous, and peaceful community I've encountered on the frontier. The next morning brought the delegation's final day, and with it, the moment Sarah had been both dreading and anticipating. Commissioner Blackwood requested a private meeting with her and Running Wolf, in the familiar setting of Running Wolf's lodge, with Grandmother Dove present as witness. The commissioner revealed the true purpose of his mission. There's been a proposal in Congress, he began carefully, to establish this community as a model for Western development. A place where different peoples can be studied, where new methods of governance can be tested. You would receive federal protection, funding for expansion, official recognition. Sarah felt her heart sink, and in return, you would need to accept government oversight. Federal appointed observers to document your methods, restrictions on who can join your community, controls on your interactions with other tribes. The silence that followed was deafening. Running Wolf's face remained impassive, but Sarah knew him well enough to see the anger burning in his eyes. Commissioner, Sarah said finally, what you're describing isn't protection. It's a gilded cage. You want to turn our community into a museum exhibit, a curiosity for politicians to point to while continuing policies that destroy other native communities. Mrs. Whitmore, please understand. No, Running Wolf interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of generations of chiefs. You understand, we built this place with blood and tears and hope. We built it free. We will not trade freedom for protection, unity for observation, family for funding. Commissioner Blackwood's expression showed he wasn't entirely surprised by this response. I hoped you would consider it. There are forces in Washington that view this community as a threat, without official recognition, without protection. We have been threatened before. Grandmother Dove spoke for the first time, her ancient voice carrying undeniable weight. We survived winter when others said we would die. We made peace when others said we would war. We built family when others said we would fail. We will survive this too. The commissioner nodded slowly. Very well. I'll report back that your community chooses to remain independent, but I must warn you, that choice comes with risks. Sarah stood, her decision crystallizing. Commissioner Blackwood, everything worthwhile comes with risks. We've learned that safety isn't found in walls or laws or government protection. Real safety comes from building something worth protecting, from creating bonds strong enough to withstand any pressure. After the delegation departed, the community gathered to discuss what had transpired. Some feared government retaliation, others worried about losing opportunities for growth and protection. Sarah addressed these concerns with words that would become legend in their community. We've proven that people of all backgrounds can live together in peace. We've shown that cooperation is stronger than conquest, that understanding defeats ignorance, that love transcends the boundaries others try to impose. She paused, looking at the mixed crowd of faces watching her. White, native, black, Hispanic, Asian, all equally valued, all equally home. The government offers us protection in exchange for our freedom, but we've learned something more valuable than protection. We've learned that true strength comes from choosing your family, that real security comes from building something together that no one person could build alone. Running Wolf stepped beside her, taking her hand in a gesture that spoke of partnership, transcending all differences. We stay free, we stay family, we stay together. The crowd erupted in approval, voices speaking agreement in multiple languages, hands raised in unified support. That night, as Sarah tucked Jonathan and Mary into their beds, her daughter asked a question that would stay with her forever. "Mama, why didn't the man from Washington understand that we're all the same inside?" Sarah thought carefully before answering. "Some people, sweetheart, only see the differences on the outside. They forget to look for the things that make us all human, our hopes, our dreams, our love for our families." "Will those people ever learn?" Jonathan asked sleepily. "Some will," Sarah replied, stroking his hair. "And those who don't, well, we'll keep showing them what's possible until they do." Years would pass. The community would face other challenges. Drought years when their cooperative approach to resource management proved essential, raids from hostile bands that their unified defense repelled, and political pressure from lawmakers who viewed their success as a reproach to traditional approaches to frontier settlement. But they would endure and thrive, becoming a beacon for other communities seeking alternatives to the cycle of violence and displacement that characterized so much of westward expansion. Sarah's memoir, eventually published as Finding Family in the Wilderness, would become required reading in schools across the nation, challenging readers to examine their assumptions about race, culture, and what constituted a valid American community. The twins would grow up to become leaders in their own right. Jonathan as a lawyer who specialized in tribal law and civil rights, Mary as a doctor who established the first integrated medical college west of the Mississippi. But all of that lay in the future. For now, Sarah stood on the hill overlooking their valley, watching the evening smoke rise from lodges and cabins alike, listening to the mixture of languages calling children home for dinner, feeling the weight of accomplishment tempered by the humility of understanding how fragile and precious their achievement truly was. She had come to this place as a widow left to die in the snow. She had survived to become a bridge between worlds, a mother to children of multiple cultures, a co-leader of a community that proved humanity's highest ideals could be lived rather than merely preached. The snow of that first winter had nearly killed her, but from that near-death experience had grown life more abundant than she could ever have imagined. Sometimes, she reflected, the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most terrifying challenges. Sometimes, the family you need is waiting, in the last place you'd think to look. Sometimes, the home you've been searching for all your life is the one you build yourself, one relationship at a time, one act of courage at a time. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Sarah whispered a prayer of gratitude, not just for survival, but for the privilege of helping to create something new under the sun. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that love was stronger than fear, that understanding was more powerful than prejudice, that family was a choice rather than an accident of birth. But tonight, surrounded by the people she'd chosen and who had chosen her, listening to her children laugh with friends whose great-grandparents had once been enemies, feeling the hand of her partner running wolf squeeze hers in shared contentment, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that every moment of suffering had been worth it. She had lost everything to find what truly mattered. She had been cast out to discover where she truly belonged. She had faced death to find a life more complete than she'd ever dared imagine. The widow in the snow had become the mother of a new kind of family, the architect of a new kind of community, the proof that the human heart knows no boundaries when it comes to love. And that, she thought, as she headed home to her children and her chosen family, was the greatest victory of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.